On this episode of Church and Main, we look at draining politics of his pathos. And we also learn what pathos is. That's coming up. Hello, and welcome to Church and Main, a podcast for people interested in the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. I'm Dennis Sanders, your host. I'm recording this on September 18th, so that is a week and 1 day after the assassination of right-wing political influencer Charlie Kirk at an event in Utah. This was a shocking event, and sadly, this is coming in a string of political violent attacks that have taken place in our nation over the last few years. Where to begin? There was here, where I'm living in Minnesota, the assassination of Melissa Hortman, who was the Speaker of the House in June, and the assassination attempt of Senator John Hoffman. There was the attempted assassination or taking out of the governor of Pennsylvania, trying to burn down the governor's mansion just shortly after he was celebrating Passover with his family. Of course, there were two assassination attempts on President Trump when he was running for president last year. In 2022, there was an attempted assassination attempt with a Supreme Court justice. Of course, right now, it just keeps going and going. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to end. A week actually before this attack, I got to actually chat with a colleague, Jason Micheli. And we got to talk about our political climate. And he actually wrote an article about 5 years ago that was entitled Deprive Them of Their Pathos. And it really kind of relates back to his theological hero, Karl Barth, and how Barth kind of dealt with a similarly politically charged time. And so it was an interesting conversation, kind of us riffing on that. And I thought it was probably a good time to share that conversation and how we can really maybe try to turn down the temperature, though I don't know how we can. I would love to see if we can. But I hope that this conversation can help and maybe trying to bring down the temperature and maybe not make politics such the center thing in our lives. But Jason is the pastor of Annandale United Methodist Church in Annandale, Virginia, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. He is one of the hosts of the Crackers and Grape Juice podcasts. He is the preacher in residence of the Iowa Preachers Project. As I said, we'll be discussing this article that he wrote that appears on his Tamed Cynic blog and also on the Mockingbird website. And it is called Deprive Them of Their Pathos. I will include that in the show notes. As I said, it was written back in 2020, and it seems like that was in these day and age like a long time ago. But in light of the recent events, the article is still very prescient. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Jason Micheli. All right, Jason. Good to have you on the podcast.
It's good to see you again.
Yeah. Just kind of a quick thing is just kind of a quick introduction of who you are. And I know people may have seen you in other podcasts and other contexts.
Who am I?
Yeah. Who are you?
uh, my name is Jason Micheli. I am a United Methodist pastor outside of DC in Northern Virginia. I have been a pastor since 2000. I've been in the Northern Virginia area for 20 years at two different churches. Yeah, I am married to a lawyer in Bethesda, Maryland. We have two sons who are almost 23 and almost 20. One just graduated from William and Mary, another just graduated from the Army basic training, and so they are launched and out of the house. Um, yeah, I do a podcast called Crackers and Grape Juice, though we have been on an unintended hiatus for a while. um, and I've written some stuff and have opinions on more stuff. So that's who I am.
All right. Well, the reason I wanted to have you on the podcast is to talk about an article you wrote actually way back in 2020. It's called Deprive Them of Their Pathos, Partisan Politics, Social Media, and Karl Barth. And, I always like to joke when something was written a few years ago that it feels like it was written a century ago. Um, but it still actually rings true today, just because of the nature of our sad state of our politics. And when it was written, you were kind of talking just about, especially in the aftermath of our election, which was at that time kind of at a crazy time in our nation's history. Um, and here we are again at a crazy time in our nation's history. But kind of before we go into kind of talking a little bit more about our current situation, can you kind of give us a little bit of a rundown of what you were trying to get at in that article and maybe the setup of what Karl Barth was trying to get at in his background?
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of surprising me with something I wrote 5 years ago, but
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah. So I wrote this in response to a good book by Angela Hancock called Karl Barth's Emergency Homiletic. Um, and so for folks who don't know, Karl Barth is probably the most significant theologian of the 20th century. Um, um, I think it was. I think it was Hans Urs von Balthasar said that Barth was the most significant theologian since Thomas Aquinas. Um, and Barth was a Swiss theologian who taught for a while in Germany. He started out as a pastor and then realized the liberal theological education that he had been formed in Germany didn't preach. And so he struggled as a pastor with how to how to proclaim the gospel, and so that caused him to go back to Paul's letter to the Romans. And so Barth wrote a series of drafts or editions of commentary on Romans that kind of provoked a decisive break with theological liberalism, um, and 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 that launched his theology. So he never, he didn't have a PhD. He was just a self-taught genius. Um, so move forward. Barth is teaching theology in Germany at the advent of the Nazi movement. And Barth early on saw the dangers that Nazism posed, and he found it problematic, especially that one of the early adopters of National Socialism was the professor of homiletics at the university where he taught. And Barth did not want future preachers to be formed by someone so compromised. And so Barth started teaching a series of uncredited lectures on homiletics. You can find them. Uh, they're collected in a little book called Homiletics that's available, made up of student notes from those lectures. But in those lectures, one of the things Bart talks about is encouraging these preachers to deprive politics of their pathos. Is the line, and Bart's understanding there, and and I should also say that Bart was someone who was very politically engaged outside of the church. Um, um, well, was a political activist. Um, but Bart understood the danger of Nazism in particular and politics in general. They function as idols in that they demand from us and draw out of us a uh, an allegiance and a fervor that is appropriate for God alone. And so that was yeah. So that was a thread I was pulling 5 years ago, and I think um, it's evergreen.
Yeah. And where do you think you're seeing it? Where did you think you were seeing it then, and where are you seeing it now?
um, I think um, to go back to this theme of theological liberalism,
Hmm.
which is different than political liberalism, it should be said. You know, one of the ways so Christianity reacted to modernism in one of two ways. One way was to retreat into fundamentalism,
Hmm.
and to treat the Bible as you would any other book and defend it with scientific rigor. So fundamentalism, and another way was to try to advocate the utility of Christianity based on its subjective helpfulness, And so I can't prove to you, Dennis, that Jesus was born of a virgin. We don't really know what to do with the resurrection, but um, you know, Christianity makes emotional sense, and therefore it's useful. That was essentially liberalism. And I think I think we're in the midst of a third iteration of that. Um, that we're not really sure what to do with the dogma of the faith. But Jesus is a helpful cipher for political engagement. And so I think there's a lot of Christians on both, and this is a bipartisan problem, right?
Yeah, it is.
That it's not just that Christianity is psychologically useful; it's that Jesus is politically useful. And so Christianity it becomes merely a vehicle for the politics that you had before you met Jesus. And I think I think I think that is a problem on both sides of the political spectrum, and I think it's a level of intensity that Christians on both sides of the political spectrum demand from their fellow believers, and I think it's inappropriate.
So, how does then what does preaching look like in such a politically charged environment? And what did it look like to Bart in such a charged environment? Because I'm actually in the midst of reading um, the Emergency Homiletic, and one of the things, there's a part where he says something to the effect of preaching as if something to the effect of preaching as if things don't matter, or something to that
Hmm.
effect. Um, and I found that fascinating to hear that. Um, and I know that if I preached that, I think some people's heads would explode. Um, but it also seems very powerful to say that. Um, and that also that there is something very, like a very strong word of faith to say that. But what does that, I mean, you know, what does that look like in an environment where I think people are almost always looking for, or at least some people, I should say, not everyone, some people are looking for basically affirmation of their own viewpoints in the pulpit.
Yeah, I think so. The quote you're referring to, um, so Barth's students, after Adolf Hitler was elected, elected. Remember,
Hmm.
it's appropriate to. It's always important to remember that he was. Um,
Well, and I think people
that
forget that.
Yeah, so that you know, um, he was democratically elected. And Barth's students were like, well, you know, Professor Bart, like, what are we supposed to preach in light of this election? And Bart said, preach as if nothing has happened. And that is not, again, Bart was a political activist. That was not a counsel for a kind of quietism. It was instead, you should preach as though Jesus is Lord. And one of the things Bart said was, um, do something about, like, don't make that little man in Berlin sound more important than he is. Um, and so it's from a position of faith, and it's also for Bart too. It was, outside beyond politics, he was very leery of preachers spending too much time talking about sin, because it's very easy to make sin more interesting than salvation. And so for Bart, it, everything should be proclaimed from the perspective of resurrection. We only know what sin is, from the hindsight of Easter, um, and and it's just, the only sin we know is overcome sin. And so we shouldn't proclaim the gospel in such a way that suggests that Dennis's salvation is in question, or that the fate of the world is up in the air. And so, um, yeah, with the Barman Declaration that Bart also wrote, he talks about joyful obedience. Um, and so um, we should be joyfully obedient in the world. Um, and and I don't get a I don't get a sense of that from a whole lot of Christians. There's and I get the alarm. I get all of it. But uh, when it comes to Christians gospeling to other people, we're called to a different kind of speech.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that brings up something I've been thinking about a lot lately is, and if you look at, and this is also something you bring up in the article, social media and things like that, there's a lot of, as I like to call, kind of flailing arms like Muppets, about things. Um, Always just kind of a lot of fear. And, and I kind of wonder, how do we as Christians talk about this or deal with this? And how do we talk about all of this and talk about the gospel, um, in this time, and not really kind of give so much into the politics that make it into a god? Because I feel sometimes that that's what we're doing, that it becomes that we're we've kind of made this into a kind of a god, and we're looking really for a savior. Um, and I'm not talking about Jesus. Um, and so there's like this fear of this devil, and we're looking for a savior. And so how do we, as preachers, I don't know, I don't want to say calm people, but maybe to give people a sense of hope, or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, um, you mentioned social media. I, I can't think of a better example of what the New Testament means by the principalities and powers. That it isn't just that our politics draw out of us an obedience that we owe to God alone. It's that we are preyed upon by powers outside of ourselves um, that sort us into ever antagonistic tribes. Like I'm not, social media, like things like this platform, like are useful. Um,
Mhm.
but the algorithms are determining how we see the world and one another, and we should be cognizant of that. Um, you know, you know, it, the, that like the idea that so many people are addicted to, uh, uh a platform like TikTok that is literally, run by an authoritarian foreign regime. It should just give us pause. And so I think part of the answer, I think, is Christians should try to opt out of the online industry of othering other Christians. Um, that I know from blogging and podcasting that there is a reward for participating in the cultural antagonisms. That if I want to write a post on, like, say, Christian nationalism, which I'm not confident actually exists, um, I'll get clickbait.
Oh yeah.
If I want to attack Christians on the left or the right, like it'll get views. It'll get but it's not helpful. Um, and so I think Paul talks about discerning the body in First Corinthians before you come to the table. I think Christians should just discern the body of their fellow believers and kind of put the devices down and kind of engage with their fellow believers as locally as possible. Because yeah, and I think Stanley Harrowitz talks about how that's the way in which Christians should be engaged politically too, as at the most local level possible, because it's there that you're guaranteed to be most free of all the isms um, um, that could compromise our political engagement.
Yeah, I'm actually just looking at your article right now, and you kind of talk about the Flight 93 moment and how,
Mm-hmm.
you know, basically how both sides have really gotten into that whole Flight 93 kind of mentality. And, um, people calling each other deplorable, um, or telling themselves they're the coalition of the decent, and othering each other, and kind of how that really all, I think, and the thing is that I see that in the church as well. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that really infects us, and I think doesn't help. And I think I think also about things like our baptismal covenant, or things like our communion, or things that tell us a different story, and how those, it seems like those things are now clashing,
Mhm.
and how as pastors we have to be aware of that. And at times I think we aren't being aware of that, and how that's very similar to what I think Bart was dealing with, is that he was seeing that kind of clashing, um, and and how the religious leaders of his time were kind of blind to that.
Yeah, I mean it's the reason why Bart didn't want a self-avowed Nazi teaching homiletics to future preachers is that he saw National Socialism in particular um, as idolatrous.
Mm-hmm.
Bart was not similarly opposed to Soviet communism because it was, it was atheistic. It didn't pose a unique Christian challenge. I do think it's obvious that there are parts of um, the MAGA movement um, that are similarly idolatrous. Not that they're Nazis, but that the president is frequently portrayed in a messianic light. Um,
Yes.
that that um, is heresy. That is heresy. Um, but to paint uh, all of his voters with the same brush, I think is um, a failure to, again, to discern the body, right? That you can't simply um, dismiss half of the country, um, with the same brush, because I think most pastors, at least in the United Methodist Church, our clergy are overwhelmingly progressive, but our congregations are 60-40. That we United Methodist voted for Donald Trump almost in the same percentages as white evangelicals. And having a good number of those people in my congregation, I know that they can explain their vote in very rational um, and earnest ways. And I don't. That doesn't mean I have to agree with them, but um, I have to take their humanity seriously, um, and not reduce them to a caricature or a meme. Um, and I think that's the mistake. Um, I think that's the mistake we make often. That um, we have certain values, not values. That there are certain commandments um, given to us. Um, that so what am I thinking? That Christians have an obligation to the poor.
Mm-hmm.
That's indisputable. But the mistake I think we make then is that, like, well, that those commandments, that covenant obligation can only be realized in only one way. Right? I think that's the mistake that we make. That we just assume that um, Christians with whom we disagree with politically don't actually care about that. Rather than, well, maybe perhaps they think there is a better way for um, that Christian ethic to be pursued. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, I mean, I think having been around mainline Christians, there is a belief too often that there is this belief that there is this ethic or belief that comes from down, as you said, care for the poor, and that the way that they believe it is done is the way, and that
Hmm.
any other way is somehow not the way. And it's like, no, you know, God did not say this is the only way to do it. No, there are many ways that can be done. And your way is not the only way that that can be done. And I think that's, I think there is a lot of room for ways for that to be done and ways for us to work that out. And I think the problem is that we get into this is the way it must be. And we then end up with this kind of clash.
Mhm.
And then therefore, well, you're bad and you're
Mhm.
sinful. And that's not how it works. And I think that's, you know, so therefore we then look at if someone believes that charity is the way that you help someone with the poor, we look down on that. And it's like, well, no, that's, if that's how they feel it, that's how they do it, then let them do that. That, God did not say this is the way you must do it. It just says, remember the poor. That's, that's the important part of it. But we get wrapped up in how it must be done.
And I think, when we sort ourselves politically, it's to the detriment of our Christian witness.
It is.
Because I think, if you are only listening to Christians on the right, um, the message of Jesus can disappear.
Hmm.
Um, uh, but I've been to plenty of gatherings on the left where Christians are welcome so long as Christianity is reduced to the golden rule.
Yep.
And both of those are impoverished witnesses to the gospel. Like you need the high Christology and you need the message of Jesus. Because yeah, I mean, like you can't separate the person and work of Jesus, and that's what we do too often. And so I think um, to get back to like where we started, you know, it, Stanley Hauerwas insists via Bart that the church is itself a politics. That we live in a culture where we are tempted to talk about politics 24/7 in every venue of our life. Um, and so to go to a place on Sunday morning for an hour, 2 hours, um, and refuse to talk about the thing that everyone wants us to talk about, and instead talk about Jesus, that is itself a political statement. Um, to come to the table and share the loaf and the cup with people that we wouldn't choose to be friends with, who are not our political allies, that is a particular kind of witness. Um, and so, yeah, and it's a way that we deprive our politics of their pathos. Um, I just, it's not that things don't matter. It's that Jesus is Lord and the future is not up to us. And I get weary of um, reductions of Christianity that either say outright or imply that we are in charge of the movement begun by the dead Jesus. Um, like I think too often that's the message that mainline Christianity gives to the world. Um, that not only is the future not up to us, it's secure in the resurrection. And so um, there is a calm that should come from that.
Yeah, I don't want it to be just up to us, because if it's up to us, oh Lord,
Mm.
especially if it's up to me, Lord have mercy.
Well, and I
Um,
was thinking too that like a big part of our, if you had to draw like what is the sin that is consistent in all of our politics, um, I think it's pride.
mhm.
And pride is a sin that God will not tolerate. Um, and so a- until we repent of our pride, um, there is no deliverance from what ails us. Like God's not going to deliver us. Like you know, like God's going to make sure that like we stay stuck in this uh until we have repented. And so yeah, whatever the answer is, it has to begin in humility, I think, and gentleness and patience.
I think that that's something I've been thinking about a lot, is that there has been too little looking in the mirror, too little confession. Um, there's been a lot of pointing fingers, but too little of what have we done wrong.
Hmm.
Um, one of the people that I like to actually listen to a lot is someone like David Brooks,
Hmm.
because he's one of the few people that is willing to actually look at things kind of from a systemic or from a whole viewpoint
Hmm.
of where have we all kind of missed out on things. Whereas a lot of writers, it's like, well, where have they done something wrong? And
Yeah,
I mean,
he had a
yeah.
he. Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? Like a lot of Trump voters, they resent that progressives look down upon them,
Hmm.
and they're not wrong.
They are not wrong. No, no, no,
They're
no.
like, you know, like they are correct to feel as though a big chunk of the country looks down on them, and so that resentment is real. And David Brooks he had a piece a few weeks ago um, about how deeply segregated the United States is,
Yep.
um, not according to race but education.
Education.
Um, and as a consequence of that, our schools are more segregated than they were in Jim Crow.
Hmm.
Um, and um, that's alarming. And that should be the thing that we're talking about. That we don't know our neighbors anymore.
No, and I still want to sometimes talk about and look at some of our churches and how
Hmm.
economically segregated they are, because
Hmm.
I'd be curious to see how segregated they truly are.
It was um so my youngest son, um, kind of announced last winter that he wanted to join the army, just kind of out of the blue. And we were like, oh, okay. And so he left in May. He graduated from basic training the first week of August in South Carolina. And so so we all went down for his graduation. And um, it was moving and impressive. Um, and it was a different kind of community.
Hmm.
Um, than I'm used to, right? So it's at the beginning of Family Day, there was a ceremony where so there's like 1,000 soldiers graduated, but I think over 50. There was a naturalization service for
Hmm.
about 50 of them, um, and I just so we're sitting there in these bleachers and. You can look out at the soldiers. It's the most diverse group of people that I've ever seen, really. Um, and I could just get a sense sitting in the bleachers that we were probably the most affluent people there.
Hmm.
Um, and so in terms of race, in terms of economics and background and everything, it was, it was a melting pot. Um, and church used to be like that. Um, and it's not.
No, no, it's
And
not.
so yeah, so it is problematic that a big chunk of the Christian church in the United States is one of the elite institutions that participates in this segregation.
Yeah, and I think that's also part of the sorting. That's also part of the pathos and all
Hmm.
of that. And yeah, so
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get too far afield, but that was one of the things I noticed as the United Methodist Church went through its slow motion divorce over sexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Um, was that I had a number of people leave my congregation, and it was less about the issue itself and more about, well, I don't want my friends to see me as part of a church with this brand. You know, it was about self image and identity more so than about like who are we including or excluding. Um, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so it's like I want to have the NPR library tote, not the Fox News library tote. It was
Yeah, because I see
so.
that with the disciples, especially because we had a similar kind of vote about 10 years ago, and that kind of became the identity. And yeah, so I get that. And I don't really like that because
Mhm.
that's not what we're about, but it became kind of a brand identity, you know.
Yeah, and I don't know what it's. I just know as a pastor in the United Methodist Church in Northern Virginia, I've like almost all the gay people I've had in my congregation are Republicans. So it's so it's like that's the one demographic where like the identity split doesn't work. So it's been, and that's the other thing too. I think about is like I have been a pastor outside of DC for a long time. Um, I've had um lots of people in my congregation are politically active. I've had, senators and things, um, and so it's like, like I'm a news junkie, but I'm like, I don't have a degree in political science. I don't have any experience, working on the Hill. Like these people don't want to listen to me opine in the pulpit. Like they want, um, I have expertise in a particular like range, and that's what they're paying me to deliver. And so yeah, preachers should, I think, be reticent to use the pulpit for things outside of what they were trained to speak to.
But that temptation is there, I think, um, because I think, especially in these times, there's this temptation that you have to say something about stuff. But I feel more and more that no, I don't.
Mhm.
Um, or I do, but in a way that makes it about the primacy of Christ in a way that it's different now that I don't feel like I don't have to be Jesus CNN or something. Um, I used to be, but I don't feel like that anymore because that's not my role. That's not who I am. That's I'm supposed to be a preacher of the gospel, not a journalist. I do have a journalism degree, but that's not what I'm doing.
Mhm.
That's not my role. And
Yeah, yeah, and to go back to Karl Barth, for him, the emergency was that the nascent authoritarian regime in Germany made it uh, made it increasingly difficult for preachers to proclaim the lordship of Jesus. And it was that was the emergency that called for the confessing church. It wasn't simply that Hitler was bad. It was that it was putting up obstacles for the preaching of the gospel. And so I think, and I think that's the rubric we have to use still, because there's always going to be issues that we think are important. There are always going to be events that there is pressure to say a word about. Um, but so long as we are free to preach the gospel, nothing is an emergency.
Yeah, since we've both been involved in the Iowa Preachers Project, one of the people who are going to be on in this second cohort, Josh Gritter, was a past guest. Um, Last year, I had asked him. Well, he was going to preach the day after or the Sunday after the election, and he was going to be starting a series um, with his wife, who was in my cohort, on the Lord's Prayer. And he said something that rang true to me and has stayed with me, that someone is coming into his church, they've been divorced or they're dealing with something. They don't want to hear about the latest whatever dealing with Trump or whoever is in office. They need to hear the good news.
Mhm.
And that has stuck with me. And I think that still matters. And I think,
And there's a way to
yeah,
there's a so that Robert Jensen says the gospel can never be preached the same way twice,
yeah,
and that's because the gospel is a promise about the future that is only possible because Jesus is raised from the dead.
mm-hmm,
And because it's a promise about the future, in order for it to be good news, it has to be responding to the present,
mm-hmm,
right? And so, if you're if you're in exile in Babylon, the promise about the future is going to sound different than if you're Dennis in America, mired in partisan acrimony.
mm-hmm,
And so, you can deliver a promise that emerges out of the muck and the mire that we're all in. That's different than exhortation. The problem with so much politically obsessed speech in the church is that it's all law. And we have red law and blue law, and we use it to beat each other to death with,
yep,
and to sort ourselves. And so yeah, I think you could speak out of the moments that we're in, but it has to be gospel. It has to be promise. Um, and to Josh's point, I think I'm not a lectionary preacher, but um, I do plan out far ahead, and so I think it's a good witness, and it encourages trust. I think with the congregation, um, that you are preaching on the text that is scheduled for the day, and you are not changing things up. Um, to react week in and week out to what's going on, because it's hard to know. And that's the other point that Bart makes in these lectures, these homiletics lectures, is um, what's truly important is often only visible to us with hindsight. And so it was a meme, right, in 2020. I don't know if it's still a thing on social media that, like, if your pastor's not preaching about immigration this Sunday, you need to find yourself another church. Like, and and I, you know, I respect the zeal that motivates a statement like that, but it's hard to know. Like, is that really the thing that needs to be said this Sunday? Maybe 5 years from now, I'll be, "Yeah, I probably should have said something about that." Like, but I don't know. And yeah, and so I wrote this in 2020, and now that we're 5 years removed from 2020, I think it's obvious that a lot of the political passion that was stirred up that year was a consequence of us being shuttered inside for months. Like we were, like we were going crazy.
yep,
And so I think there's always other forces that are motivating events and speech and things, and um, yeah, I think we just have to um, have more patience.
Well, if people want to know more about and follow you, where should they go?
Uh, it's tamedcynic.org is the domain name for my Substack. I stole it from Reinhold Niebuhr, um, which was the first. Leaves from the Notebook of a Tamed Cynic was the first book that my pastor gave me when I became a Christian when I was 17. So um, that's the importance of it.
Mhm. All right. Jason, it was good chatting with you. I hope to chat with you.
Yeah, yeah. Likewise.
So, what are your thoughts on the episode? Feel free to leave your thoughts by sending me an email at churchandmain@substack.com. As I said, I will include links to the article in the show notes, as well as links to the Tamed Cynic blog and the Crackers and Grape Juice podcasts. If you want to learn more about this podcast, listen to past episodes, or donate, visit churchandmain.org. You can also visit churchandmain.substack.com to read related articles. Subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast app, and please leave a review. That helps others find this podcast. Feel free to make a donation. I leave a link in the show notes that will help pay for the cost of this podcast to keep producing great content like this episode. Also, there is a link also if you would like to receive this episode and others like it in your email inbox. That is it for this episode of Church and Main. As I like to say, thank you so much for listening. Take care, everyone. Godspeed. And I will see you very soon.